Hi guys, I'm Reha and you're about to listen to a BBC Trending podcast. But before you do, just a heads up, it's only audio. Here's just another place to listen to the stuff we make. We're trying something new here. We hope you like it.
Just the other day, I found myself on YouTube looking for videos about next week's elections for the European Parliament.
Wow, Marco, sounds like a wild evening at your house.
The absolute wildest. So, as I was going through the various results, I came across a video uploaded by a news channel called RT. And in case you haven't heard of them, they used to be called Russia Today. And they're essentially a news network funded by the Russian government. Their mission, they say, is to share with the world the Russian take on the news. But their critics have accused them of being a propaganda tool for the Kremlin.
So, this video that you saw, what did it actually say?
The video reminded people that the last time these elections happened, 5 years ago, anti-establishment, populist, anti-EU parties gained a large number of seats in the European Parliament. And although they're unlikely to get their first majority this time around, polls suggest even more of their candidates are expected to get elected. But according to this RT video, this is a rather worrying prospect for centrist politicians from traditional parties.
That's got some questioning, whether there's a secret driving force behind it all. It's Russian meddling, of course. What else were you thinking?
In case you missed the sarcasm there, what this RT report seems to be suggesting is this. Rather than acknowledging people's genuine support for Eurosceptic and populist movements, both on the right and the left, centrist politicians across the EU prefer to blame it all on the supposed interference by a foreign country, Russia.
Now that is, of course, RT's take on the subject. Again, it's worth repeating, they are funded by the Russian government.
Yeah, but you know what? This video actually got me thinking. If RT felt the need to ridicule to its viewers these accusations of Russian meddling in the European elections, could there be any truth in them? That's what we're looking into today.
This is BBC Trending, the podcast that takes an in-depth look into the world of social media. I'm Mike Wendling, and with me is our reporter Marco Silva, who's been delving into this story.
And we begin our journey in Brussels, the heart of the European Union.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at this.
We need to go back to December last year to a press conference where the European Commission, the executive arm of the EU, announced what they called an action plan against disinformation.
Disinformation, obviously a term that we have covered a lot in this programme. To be very clear about it, when we say that, we are referring to false or misleading information deliberately created and shared to deceive people for economic or political gain.
Right, and in that conference there was a particular moment that stood out for me. It involved Andrus Ansip. He's the Vice President of the European Commission in charge of the digital single market.
There is strong evidence pointing to Russia as a primary source of disinformation in Europe. Disinformation is part of Russia's military doctrine and its strategy to divide and weaken the West. Russia spends 1.1 billion euros a year on pro-Kremlin media.
Right, so pointing the finger pretty clearly at Russia.
Yes, EU officials have accused Russia of meddling in various elections that took place across Europe in recent years, including in France, in Germany. And to do that, they say Russia has used an array of tactics, from spreading fake news and disinformation on social media to hacking and cyber attacks, or even by simply endorsing politicians with views aligned with the Kremlin's. And the goals are always the same.
To divide the European public, to reduce our confidence in mainstream politics and mainstream media, to confuse us, and therefore to slow consensus and decision-making in a zero-sum game by which the Kremlin sees the best way to strengthen itself is to weaken its opponent.
That's Giles Portman. He's the man in charge of the East Stratcom Task Force, a team of 15 people whose job is to identify and expose Russian disinformation against the EU.
These are people working for the EU who are directly challenging what they say is Russian disinformation. Marco, do you have some examples?
Yes, they've debunked, for example, suggestions on RT that British intelligence has tried to sow confusion about the attempted poisoning of a former Russian spy and his daughter in Salisbury last year.
This, of course, was a huge story, big international news, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, it's important to say this. British prosecutors have produced enough evidence to charge 2 Russian men with conspiracy to murder and other charges.
Okay, so that's one story they've debunked. Any more?
Yes, here's another one. A piece by a Russian TV channel suggesting that a Christmas TV concert was cancelled in Sweden to avoid irritating Muslim immigrants. That was false, of course. As it turns out, the concert was cancelled due to a delay on budget and logistics planning.
Oh no, Christmas cancelled.
Indeed. So in the past, the East Stratcom task force has been super reluctant to speak to the media about the work they do. But because they're one of the teams mentioned in that action plan I was talking about earlier, I really wanted to hear from them. So when I finally got to speak to Giles, I asked him whether his team had uncovered any evidence suggesting Russia is trying to sway the upcoming European elections.
What we can see at the moment is this continuation of a message that Europe is collapsing, that it's a question of Europe's elites not paying attention to ordinary people, that Europe's values and identities are under threat, that it's in danger of imminent collapse, and a message basically that you shouldn't bother voting because you have no power to influence things.
Since it was set up back in 2015, the task force has identified more than 4,500 disinformation cases online. They've listed them on a database open to anyone, and many of those cases were included in a newsletter they release every week. It's called EU versus Disinfo. Most of the reported cases are actually news pieces published by Russian media outlets with links to the Kremlin. The likes of RT, the TV network we mentioned earlier, or Sputnik, a news agency funded by Moscow. But at first, it also took a closer look at stories published by media outlets within the European Union, not just outside, and that landed them in hot water. It all began when EU versus Disinfo listed articles published by 3 Dutch media outlets, a regional newspaper, a right-leaning blog, and a small news website as examples of disinformation. That was because of their reporting on stories about Ukraine. As a result, the 3 publications joined forces and sued the European Union. Things got so out of hand that the Dutch Parliament was at one point calling for the EU versus Disinfo website to be shut down altogether.
So, just to sum up, this EU-funded group labelled news outlets as disinformation sources simply for daring to disagree with Brussels.
Well, that's how these Dutch journalists saw it, at least. And even though EU versus Disinfo did admit their mistake and eventually removed all 3 pieces from its database, the case did raise an interesting question. How can the task force be sure that in their mission to crack down on supposed Russian disinformation, they don't end up cracking down or at least shunning those who have genuine concerns about the shortcomings, the failures, the inefficiencies of the EU?
We do acknowledge that 1 or 2 member states have had concerns about the operation, and particularly the concern that we must make sure that when identifying examples of disinformation, we in no way suggest that we are trying to tell people what to believe, how to vote, or interfere in people's right to hold whatever opinion they may wish to hold. We're not questioning the debate itself. We're just questioning the manipulation of the debate and saying that that debate and people's opinions are best based on facts rather than disinformation.
As a result of this clash with Dutch media, Giles tells me that the task force is now clear it should only focus on Russian state media and Russian outlets operating in Europe, not mainstream media outlets inside the EU. Which just comes to show how difficult it can sometimes be to separate what is foreign disinformation from genuine democratic debate.
Marco, I know it's not just about this task force, so tell me, what else is the EU doing?
Well, there's the awareness side of things, teaching people across the EU how to be a bit more media savvy, how to be more mindful when they're confronted with fake news stories. They've also brought together all the tech giants, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and made them commit to specific measures addressing the EU's concerns. They created ad archives to list political ads placed on their platforms. They removed scores of fake accounts and pages and took action against content that was seen as disinformation. And there's also a rapid alert system.
A rapid alert system. Okay, what's that?
Well, it's a network of EU officials and experts across Europe who are constantly sharing their analysis of disinformation threats and have the ability to respond in real time to a critical threat. So if someone sounds the alarm, as it were, everyone across this network will be aware of it, and together they will try to respond to it. Problem is, although it's been up since mid-March, no alert has actually been triggered. Could it be the threat has been blown out of proportion? Giles Portman again.
It is focused primarily on the external disinformation challenge, and it is, in its early days, focusing in particular on sharing best practice. So I think that the fact that it hasn't sort of published sensational alerts at the moment in these very early days, I wouldn't really be reading anything into that.
But even if the dog hasn't barked, one thing is for sure. European voters are worried about disinformation and misinformation online. According to a EU poll released last September, 73% said this was a concern for them in the run-up to an election. For most of us, disinformation and fake news only became a big topic of conversation in recent years, after the US presidential elections of 2016, where, according to US intelligence agencies, Russia secretly tried to boost Donald Trump's campaign. It's an accusation Moscow denies, by the way, but for some countries, this sort of threat isn't new.
It's often said that when large countries with a long history of independence and open elections talk about this as a new threat, Estonia laughs.
Lisa Past used to be the Chief Research Officer at the Estonian Information System Authority, the part of the Estonian state that deals with cyber threats. Located on the border with Russia, Estonia has had to live with the constant threat of Russian interference ever since it gained independence from the Soviet Union back in 1991. So, when it comes to influencing or swaying elections, Lisa knows how Moscow operates.
It's been very clear that as the attacker, Russian Federation and its related bodies are throwing spaghetti at the wall, if you will. They are trying to attack our belief in our democracy in any number of ways and seeing what sticks. And what has stuck in recent years is social media-led disinformation campaigns, theft of information, data, and emails relating to candidates and campaigns.
When it comes to stealing data and emails, it's worth saying this is exactly what happened during the 2016 US presidential election. 12 Russians were accused of hacking Democratic officials. But Marco, I'm wondering, is there any evidence that links Moscow to cyber attacks or hacking in the run-up to these current European elections?
Well, I'm not sure whether you can call it a smoking gun, but there are certainly reports worth looking into. So last February, Microsoft, the American tech company, published a blog post blaming a number of attacks against European think tanks and non-profit organizations on a hacking group with connections to Russian military intelligence. And cybersecurity companies like FireEye in the US have also detailed attempts by Russian state-sponsored hackers to gain access to networks run by various European governments. Moscow, of course, has in the past denied using such tactics. But it begs the question, is the EU really prepared to deal with such a threat?
5 years ago, the international security landscape and the understanding of the threats, and most likely also the nature of threats, was very different. So we don't fully know how prepared we are until election day. But I do really worry that others are learning from the Russian playbook, because current responses, diplomatic and particularly sanctions, aren't enough. They don't serve as convincing deterrents.
So, who might be borrowing a page from Russia's playbook?
My name is Olga Robinson, and I'm a senior journalist with BBC Monitoring and its disinformation team.
Olga's been busy looking for signs of Russian interference in the run-up to the European elections. Specifically, she's been zooming in on the conversations happening on Italian social media.
It is not very difficult to find accounts that look suspicious and do seem to be pushing some of the pro-Kremlin lines or amplifying Sputnik or Russia Today, but their impact normally seems to be quite low. What we haven't seen is a massive covert operation specifically based on Twitter or Facebook. It could work both ways. It either doesn't exist and we're not seeing it, or it is adapting and hiding and covering its tracks a little bit better.
But here's the thing. Even if it's harder to spot actual Kremlin-led disinformation, Olga says a perhaps more worrying phenomenon is on the rise. And that is local actors, local parties, local movements adopting tactics and tools that in recent years have been allegedly used by Russia.
We do seem to be seeing a lot of activity on various partisan groups on Facebook in particular. And these groups seem to be pushing highly polarized content. They do seem to be also based in their home countries. And some of the messages that I've seen over the past few weeks have been built and based on complete lies. One of my favorites over the past few weeks was a post that was picked up by several groups, which featured the head of the Democratic Party, Nicola Zingaretti, who allegedly says in the tweet that after the party wins the European elections, they are going to appeal to the European Commission to issue an order so that all ports in Italy are open to migrants. And the number that he uses is 800,000 Libyan migrants that are allegedly heading to Italian shores. He said himself he had never said that, and he actually complained to the police, according to Italian media reports, and he blames it on his opponents, who he says are spreading this disinformation about him.
There is a revival of Cold War rhetoric, which is, of course, a political choice. But what it does is that it depoliticizes the problem and it makes an internal threat seem external.
Julia Rone is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge. She came onto my radar after she published a blog post online where she argued Brussels often misses the point when talking about disinformation.
By focusing on them, the European Commission is shifting the focus from the more pressing underlying political issues. And that's dangerous because we believe that there is an apolitical fix. Well, there isn't. There are people who are legitimately worried about economic inequality, about youth unemployment, and also actually about migration. So there is a lot of mobilization from the far right all across Europe, and it cannot be attributed simply to foreign agents. One of the reasons why foreign disinformation, let's say, is successful is the very eager reaction by local political actors who appropriate these messages.
In essence, Marco, it's the easy way out for the European Union to say people's discontent against the establishment is a result of foreign manipulation. A lot easier than admitting people have actual real concerns that politicians are failing to address.
That's exactly what Yulia's saying. We asked the Russian embassy here in UK for an interview. They didn't give us one, but sent us this statement.
Accusations that Russia is engaging in somewhat disinformation campaign on European elections are completely false and unsubstantiated. Furthermore, there is no, and there cannot be, any evidence of alleged Russian cyber interference, Russian hackers, and other similar fake claims.
We also approached Kremlin-owned Sputnik and RT and asked them to comment on the accusation they're playing a key part in Russia's disinformation strategy. Sputnik didn't reply. RT's deputy editor-in-chief, Anna Belkina, sent us a statement saying such claims only silence and force out legitimate voices from public debate. And it also added,
"It is beyond naive to think that if RT didn't exist, the issues we cover wouldn't exist. It is an insult to millions of the EU citizens to broadly paint them as fringe and dismiss their concerns. Overlooking dissenting voices is what has long undermined the political establishment, not RT. When it comes to even the smallest protest in Russia, the mainstream media churns out headline after headline and is applauded for it. Conversely, if RT covers major discontent in Europe, we are treated as a security threat."
Marco, one last question, and again, these European elections are just a few days away. Is there anything people can do to protect themselves against disinformation, whether that comes from Russia or not?
Well, I'll give the last word to Giles Portman, the head of the East Stratcom Task Force.
Wherever disinformation may come from, it's incumbent on all of us to be a little bit more careful about how we handle the media we consume, especially social media. So that means checking the outlet, checking the author, checking the sources, and finally thinking before we share.
The kind of advice that you'll recognize if you're one of our regular listeners. We've given it many, many times, but it's well worth repeating and bearing in mind the next time you go online.
And that's it for today's edition of the BBC Trending Podcast. I'm Mike Wendling. Our reporter was Marco Silva. Special thanks to Jonathan Griffin, to Ed Main, and to our production coordinator, Sarah Jackson. Neva Masirian recorded and mixed the podcast.
If you'd like to get in touch with me about anything you heard here, send me an email to Marco, that's MARCO, .silva, S for sugar, ILVA, at bbc.co.uk. Alternatively, you can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Just search for BBC Trending. We're very, very easy to find.